Hi! Today we talk about the 5-year anniversary of the oven-ready, easy-to-pour, grab-and-go political debacle of Brexit, which liberated Britain from the tyranny of the most beneficial political alliance it has ever been a part of. Stop booing, it's the best thing that ever happened to Britain according to, well,
None of the Brexiteers knew what Brexit was actually going to look like.
The political steps undertaken do not resonate with this.
It's always going to make more sense for the UK when it comes to making a choice between Europe and the United States to go with Europe.
Hypothetically, of course, the UK could rejoin the EU.
All in all, we can say that Brexit, as far as the Britons are concerned, has not been a success.
Hello, and welcome to the Standard Time Talk Show. I'm your host, Reka Kinga-Pop, and on this European talk show, we tackle important, relevant, and timely topics, so let's get into it. So, it's been 5 years since Brexit, a gigantic step in the glorious strife of Britain, trying to destroy themselves from within. I understand. Who wouldn't dream of bringing their economy down, flaring up old grievances, and alienating themselves from an economic union that has been shaped to benefit them immensely? A thin majority of Brits voted in the summer of 2016 to leave the European Union, following a vicious campaign fueled by dark money, marred by disinformation and shameless lies, and hate-mongering against immigrants, among them prominently my kind, Eastern Europeans who moved to the UK in the name of one of the 4 freedoms the European Union claims for its citizens. Those set against this voluntary union seem to be quite content with the free movement of goods, services and capital, but man, were they upset about the free movement of labor and persons. Let's take a moment to look back briefly, and I mean very briefly, on how Brexit came to be, and not so briefly what Russian dark money had to do with it. On the 1st of January 1973, the UK joined the European Communities, the caterpillar stage of what would later become the butterfly of the EU. Over the following 4 decades, until the Brexit vote, a certain blend of Euroscepticism had built up gradually, reaching their peak in the early 2010s. It included a lot of tomfoolery, from the false claims that the EU regulates the acceptable curvature of bananas, to the straight-faced lies about the UK supposedly having to pay to sustain poorer member countries. Boris Johnson was among the early birds in this discourse, but the most prominent proponent was Nigel Farage, a political marvel in his own right, who has been bouncing about the right and far-right British politics for quite some time now. As the public discussion started to get out of hand, then Prime Minister David Cameron had the great idea to call a referendum on whether or not Britain should be leaving the EU right after the Conservative Party won the majority in the 2015 general elections. Cameron had thought it would quell the grumbling spearheaded by Nigel Farage, thinking the whole idea sufficiently absurd to never gain ground. And he turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Neither of the major parties campaigned too much for remaining in the EU, wishing to avoid unnecessary strife. The vote was held on the 23rd of June 2016, and a super tight majority of only 51.89% voted for leaving the EU. The following day, Brits started to frantically Google search questions like, what does it mean to leave the EU? And what is the EU? Not so informed a choice now, was it? And Cameron? He resigned shortly, giving way to Theresa May, who failed trying to implement Brexit. She handed over to the infamous political bozo Boris Johnson, who resigned in disgrace, only to usher in Rishi Sunak, who suffered the worst electoral defeat in decades. Brexit was, in fact, enacted on the 31st of January of 2020, which not only brought immediately economic backlash, but also made the UK struggle with the emerging COVID-19 pandemic much worse. As a global exception, the UK now operates in a bit of a blind spot, without sufficient international alliances with its neighbors. My main source of schadenfreude is Brexit ever since. The arrogance, the misguided and self-absorbed apologies for this great big mess-up. It would be, however, foolish to blame Brexit on the individual voters or to forget about its victims. because it very much looks like this disastrous decision wasn't brought about merely by a foppish froghead quacking pseudo-racist lies on TV panel discussions, if you know what I mean. It very much looks like dark money had at least as much a role to play. The National Crime Agency started investigating Aaron Banks, the biggest Brexit donor, and others linked to the Leave campaign for possible criminal activity during the Brexit referendum. This happened after the Electoral Commission found reason to believe that Banks was not the real source of the £8 million he gave to the pro-Brexit groups. The investigation began after reports from Open Democracy and others questioned how Banks could afford to be the biggest political donor in UK history. Let's look at the Conservative Party, especially at David Cameron and Boris Johnson. According to an article by The Guardian, the Prime Minister has defended donations made to his party by close Putin associates. Journalist Gina Miller put it this way: think of Brexit as a matryoshka, or a Russian nesting doll, with voting to leave the EU as the outer doll. Pulling off the outer doll reveals another doll that represents something much more worrying. 5 years have passed since the separation, and today the UK's fate is much less certain. Donald Trump's erratic and arbitrary foreign policy has shaken up the world economic order. Trump has also emboldened Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and much of Europe is preparing for a possible expansion of the war. There are new epidemics on the rise. Shall I go on? Or will these factors suffice to persuade you that the United Kingdom is in a much tighter spot than before, forced to rethink its alliances? Today's guests will talk us through the scenarios and the lessons learned. Roos Fransen is a Dutch researcher focusing on European and international law at the University of Vienna. Her work spans a broad range, including the work of the European Union. Luke Cooper is an academic at the LSE and a co-host of the Another Europe podcast. His latest book, Authoritarian Contagion: The Global Threat to Democracy, situated the politics of Brexit and Trump in the global resurgence of far-right nationalism. And Misha Glenny is the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, one of Austria's leading advanced research institutes. A longtime BBC Central Europe correspondent, he covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe and the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Misha is a sought-after speaker of the geopolitics of cybersecurity and organized crime. And today we are hosted by the Library of the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Big thank you to them. Hello, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me about Brexit. I want to start with you, Misha, if you don't mind. Already 5-6 years ago, you have been speculating, forecasting, analyzing what Brexit would mean for the entire Union, or the rest of the Union, as you phrased then. Now EU skepticism seems to be rising. There's a strong polarization between a push for a stronger, more concentrated Union, or a looser Union, or even departure from the EU.
Well, I don't think that latter point that you're making is directly related to Brexit, and let me explain why. One of the first impacts of Brexit was actually to reduce the desire amongst populations in the rest of the Union to leave the European Union, because they saw what the dismantling of 40 years of regulatory alignment between the United Kingdom and Brussels actually meant. It brought few, if any, advantages and a whole range of disadvantages. Some of them are to do with that dismantling of the regulatory alignment. Some are to do with the specific nature of constitutional arrangements in the United Kingdom, particularly as regards Northern Ireland. But we now know, looking back, that we have lost at least 4% of our economy. It's actually increased the red tape that Britons have to deal with, in particular when they're trading with the European Union, and given that the European Union is by far our largest trading partner. And so what you've seen in opinion polls since then is that the number of people who want to return to the European Union has actually crossed over the 60% mark to about 66% now. So all in all, we can say that Brexit, as far as the Britons are concerned, has not been a success. I think that it's also dampened the desire for a Frexit or an Erxit or a whatever it is, Xit. That issue you said at the end, though, about rising skepticism, a polarization, that's got less to do with the European Union per se, and more to do with or at least it's influenced by a whole range of other issues, above all else, migration, but also the impact of social media. We are also quite sensitive towards what's happened in the United States. There's the issue of Ukraine, which has polarized electorates in various countries. And after Trump's election in the United States, I think that sentiment is strengthening all the time.
You mentioned the desire of, or even the thinking of rejoining the Union. Roos, you're a person for rules and regulations and how things actually get done. Mm-hmm. Is there even a possibility and a pathway for that?
This comes with a couple of conditions. The main one that the Union promotes is that member states must uphold the values of the Union, which is why, for example, a lot of Southern Eastern European states have not been able to join, as one of the primary conditions is democracy and have the highest standards of anti-corruption. So in general, when it comes to international organizations, there's always a withdrawal clause, which is Article 50 that was used and was, highly publicized during the Brexit negotiations. And there's also an entry clause, which is Article 49. Furthermore, there has to be an agreement made between the acceding state and the member states, which has to be agreed upon unanimously by all member states. Hypothetically, of course, the UK could rejoin the EU if you just are looking at black letter law. If you're looking at everything else in the European Union, as it's very difficult to look at international and European law as just that, you have to consider the political and diplomatic factors. Whilst the consensus in the UK may be that they want to rejoin, the political steps undertaken do not resonate with this. For example, the UK has not rejoined EFTA, which is what, for example, Norway and Iceland are part of the Free Trading Association, which they very much were allowed to do. There have been no moves towards that. And
I guess also because EFTA also comes with financial obligations.
Yes, it comes with obligations, which was one of the main selling points as to why the UK wanted to leave, being we do not want the obligations that come with any European association. The biggest crisis in UK perspective is at Calais, at the English Channel. This would have to be addressed, and from my knowledge of UK politics, which is relatively okay but not vast, this is something that we would all like to shove under the table a little bit more, or at least use as a political tool to gain voters.
Yeah, although, correct me if I'm wrong here, but my impression back in 2016 during the vote was that the main concern was with our compatriots, mostly Eastern Europeans like myself and my Slav cousins. The idea of maybe take these backseas, maybe walking this back, came up the day after the Brexit vote. Why did very few people campaign for Remain? For instance, the major opposition party, Labour, zero campaigning on Remain. How is that possible?
Well, I wouldn't say there was zero campaigning for Remain. I mean, I'm probably likely to be a bit defensive here as both a Labour Party member in my spare time and a one-time Remain campaigner in that very referendum. Well, I think that it was certainly the case that the Labour leader at the time was not an organic enthusiast for the European Union. So he wasn't the most passionate advocate. I would say I don't think that was the reason that the Remain campaign went down in quite the way that it did. I think there you'd have to blame the government of the day, David Cameron, but also the broader political context at the time. So what the Remain campaign had as its main idea is that more or less things were fine. Britain was fine. Maybe it's been through a tough few years for austerity, but it was on the right track and everything was okay. And the basic structural problem that the campaign encountered is that a lot of Britons at the time and since, didn't think things were going fine at all, like many places in Europe. I think the other problem was the coincidence of timing of the referendum with the real peak of the Eurozone crisis and the refugee crisis. I think it was really quite different because up until that point of the Eurozone crisis, that of course dragged on for all of those years, the really big argument for the European Union in Britain was that this was an economically competent outfit. And even though we don't particularly like giving up our sovereignty to anyone, because there's a kind of incipient xenophobia and nationalism that's very strong here, nonetheless we're happy to make that concession for a bloc that works.
Misha, you also wrote about how Brexit is a great opportunity for organized crime.
Whenever you put borders up, you are creating opportunities for organized crime. Having said that, the UK was outside of the Schengen zone, so it had quite a few borders, but it also had a very good integration in policing the European Union. Outside the European Union, that doesn't work anymore. And so it gives criminals and ne'er-do-wells real opportunities, particularly when you don't have, as in the United Kingdom, enough investment in the border infrastructure that you're putting up. Some of those regions which voted for Brexit most heavily were actually recipients, considerable recipients of EU structural funding. So if you take somewhere like Cornwall, which is the poorest county in England, Cornwall has been devastated by Brexit because on its own, London doesn't have the financial firepower to compensate for the money that was being fed into Cornwall by Brussels. And one thing which, if you tell Britons, they still to this day don't understand, that the percentage of our budget that went to Brussels was 0.7% of the budget, just 0.7%. And the value we got out of that 0.7%, well, we know now it's 4% of the economy that we get back. So you have to look elsewhere. You have to look, I think, in terms of emotions when it comes to why Brexit was so powerful. Along with the one thing which Luke and I, I'm sure, really agree on is that the austerity policies which George Osborne introduced after 2010 as Chancellor of the Exchequer were an absolute disaster.
The EU is often cited as an economic project, but quite as much it's a legalistic project, and a gigantic one at that. How do you see this harmonization process, which is often very fraught?
It is very important to separate the EU from more traditional international organizations like the UN, where the UN is an intergovernmental organization, which means that it is very much a separate entity from a state, whereas the European Union is more often described as a supranational organization, meaning it has actual legal influence. And harmonization, whilst heavily published, funnily enough, is a major topic discussed in your law school early days because no one understands what it actually means. Harmonization essentially is the idea that if we look purely from an economic standpoint first, we want to make sure that companies do not receive benefits from having economic activity in one country over another due to their regulations. In Austria, there has been a discussion regarding gold plating, which is essentially countries going above and beyond and implementing the minimum measures, but then also trying to make them as perfect as possible. That's actually not what the EU wants. The EU wants you to implement the legislation they produce as carbon copy as possible, which is actually what the UK was doing for a very long time, is taking the directive that the Commission may produce and just saying, okay, this applies now. I believe you guys joined in 74.
That's right. We had the referendum and we joined the EEC, as it was, the European Economic Community. So we were latecomers, and for a long time the French were determined to keep Britain out of the EEC. So no, we were not one of the founders, one of the instigators of this, but we became very enthusiastic members very quickly.
Yeah. I come from the Netherlands, which does the same as the UK in that we quite literally take the legislation that is given and implement it as is. And for us, that has worked out quite well.
This current huge upheaval, which many have termed the collapse of the pre-existing world order, as it is now with the war in Ukraine, exacerbated, or I would say further unstabilized by the Trump administration. This seems to give a huge opportunity for Britain to reposition itself. What do you think, Luke?
Yes, I mean, I agree. I think that the crisis and the UK's role in European security does present a kind of geopolitical opportunity, you could say, for the UK, given that we spend a reasonable amount of money on defence compared to some other Western European nations, and that we're considered important. I mean, there's kind of two positions, I'd say, among European states at the moment with regard to this American administration. One you could refer to as the Starmer position or the British position, which is broadly, we think it's possible to keep the United States on side and to secure the 80-year relationship between the United States and Europe. And then the second position after Starmer, I think, is encapsulated by the incoming Chancellor of Germany, Merz, who's dared in a way to call for independence from the United States. I think a pretty striking thing for an ardent transatlanticist to do, and a real sign of the historicity of this moment. Europe is the UK's largest trading partner, so it's always going to make more sense for the UK when it comes to making a choice between Europe and the United States to go with Europe. To my pleasant surprise, and perhaps to the pleasant surprise of your watchers and viewers and listeners, the UK is actually the most anti-Trump country in Europe. For the UK government, in the end, I think it's really the clock is ticking for how long this position can last, because it seems pretty untenable to me.
We owe a huge thank you to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna for hosting us in their library for this discussion. It's not only one of the most prestigious and storied art academies in Europe, but also impressively forward-thinking and innovative. We're honored to be filming this episode in a place where tradition meets bold creativity. Thank you.
When Brexit was decided upon and implemented, we weren't yet in a world, although I think we were heading there, of large trading blocks. So the UK comes out just at the wrong time, just as these large trading blocks start to consolidate. And that isn't just Trump. It was when Biden introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and so on, massive state subsidies giving unfair competition or subsidizing big US companies. Chinese were doing the same. The European Union responded. And there's the United Kingdom outside of the European Union. It doesn't have the financial firepower to compete with either the US or the EU. So Britain, just at the time when you need to be part of a strong union of some form or another, is out on its own and extremely vulnerable.
I totally agree, as you know, Misha. But I just wanted to add, I think the earlier you opened with some maybe slightly optimistic description of the opinion polling in the UK vis-a-vis the European Union, let's say. I think what has changed now isn't really about opinion polling, that since 2022 and the disaster of British politics in that year, fall of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, it's been pretty consistent that Rejoin would win. What I think has changed right now is that Rejoin have a winning message, which is the security and defence of Britain means the security and defence of Europe.
It is also quite odd in the current geopolitical and international legal climate to have a country so out of any regional international organization. I mean, every country on this earth is, well, maybe except for North Korea as a shining example, is in some form or another associated with a regional organization, whether it be a purely economic union as we see them in Africa, or a more security-based union like the OSCE, but also, the successor of the Warsaw Pact in Asia. And in the former USSR countries, it's such an oddity to have a country like the UK, which is traditionally seen as an absolute powerhouse, be so on its own, which is in academic terms very interesting to observe.
None of the Brexiteers knew what Brexit was actually going to look like. It was all on a wing and a prayer, and you had lots of different groups thinking that they would see it as an anti-immigration thing. Well, that turned out to be wrong. Others who saw it as a way of getting closer to America, well, that was very risky. And others saw in sovereignty somehow a way of inspiring the nation. And again, that's a failure. Others said that potential problems like the constitutional relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, or Scotland and England and Wales and England, they said, oh, well, these are not going to be serious problems. They're actually deeply serious problems. So it was, it was a fantasy project that sadly became reality because of a peculiar constellation of political, economic, and social circumstances.
And many investigative journalists argue an infusion of a lot of dark money into the campaign that, due to the nature of promotion and social media, like fragmented communications, wasn't very obviously visible at the time.
And also we had, the main media outlets, private media outlets above all, Rupert Murdoch's newspaper stable, Lord Rothermere's Daily Mail, and the Barclay Brothers Daily Telegraph. 85% of the print media in the UK, of the major print media, run by octogenarians who didn't live in the United Kingdom and in some cases were not British citizens.
I agree with you that the responsibility of journalists and media conglomerates cannot really be overstated in these cases, and generally in the level of public discourse that we live with. Is it possible to use this opportunity for the UK to step up in support of Ukraine against Russian aggression and thus gradually get closer to the Union? Because as haphazardly as Brexit was done, I assume that a very haphazard attempt to rejoin may also generate a couple of huge mistakes.
I think you're right in your question that it will be done in a series of stages, and they probably won't be very dramatic. They will probably be quite dull. But I mean, I think British participation in some kind of European force on the ground in Ukraine, if it happens, and I mean, it's a very big if at the moment. I mean, it really will depend, I think, on whether those 15 nations have confidence in the agreement that has been struck and have confidence in it lasting. What I would say is that I think, something that your IWM colleague Tim Snyder says, Misha, he likes to say that there's the myth of the European peace project. And really, Europe is better seen as a kind of post-colonial project. Empires collapsed and European states saw a necessity, not just an opportunity, to do something else. And that something else was the European Union. And I think Ukraine's membership of the European Union will really, I think, pose that quite strongly, or pose the need to be clear about that decision, that this is a security project as much as it is a peace project.
Especially now with NATO very rapidly, well, changing in significance, to put it very mildly, because as much as I understand, the concept was that NATO is the security union and the EU is the legal and economic union that complement each other. And now with the US being so volatile, that doesn't seem to work the way it had been intended, especially in terms of extreme military dependence on the US in every regard.
The project of how do you adjust European security if NATO is significantly weakened or collapses. In the past 10 to 12 years, we've seen the process called digital transformation, which means shifting everything from hardware into the cloud. And have a look at who controls the cloud, whether you're a police force, whether you're military, whether you're in a corporation, or whether you're in a home user. It's Amazon Web Services, it's Google, and then for the security issues, you have Cloudflare, you have CrowdStrike. Where are all these companies based? They're based in the United States. So we are completely and utterly dependent on American-owned cyber infrastructure, weapons infrastructure, and robotics. If we want to create a European security network, we also have to face the challenge of coming up with an alternative to GPS, Galileo, whatever it's going to be. And at the moment, there might be a sort of theoretical appetite for it, but there's certainly no capacity and capability to do that sort of thing. And either Europe gets its act together, or it's going to have to accept a semi-colonialist relationship with the United States, or pick China. Who knows?
The EU has pretty much led the way, at least at its own scale, in regulating the digital space, especially which the US has been extremely reluctant to touch.
I mean, you know, the Trump 2.0 is Silicon Valley in a fundamental respect. You know, they've all lined up. Have a look at who was there in the first line at the inauguration. It was Musk, it was Thiel, it was Zuckerberg, it was Bezos. They were all there. And you're seeing what Elon Musk is doing, you know, gutting the American states, tossing it all out like yesterday's offal. I mean, these people have immense power. They do not want regulatory systems like the EU has in place.
The EU prides itself so much on the regulations done in the digital space. I mean, it started with the privacy legislation in the GDPR, but it goes much further. And I do not think it would be an option to fully abandon that. I think one could speak about maybe loosening a little. And I think there will be a certain sense of paranoia for these companies who are all of a sudden back invited in with looser legislation. So I do not think it's a possibility that's going to happen.
Is there a component of pride, somehow like an extension of national pride that we can expect to develop around the EU over time? Because it's right now, it's very much not just a supranational, but also kind of a post-national project that didn't demand to be your identity. There have been attempts, but let's be honest, not very successful.
Speaking out of personal views, especially as I was the demographic that was definitely targeted with these marketing attempts of making it a one Europe, I do not think so, because we are in that way very different from the United States, which is a federal state. However, they may claim that they have more different ethnicities and cultures than we do. There's such rich history in the individual nation states of the European Union that it will be practically impossible to have one common identity that you cannot expect someone from Germany to have the complete same values as someone from Croatia. There's such cultural significant differences that it's going to be very difficult to have a proud European identity.
I mean, it's survival, not sentimentality. I mean, look at what's happening the other side of the Atlantic. You would much rather be in Europe than you would be Canada right now, I think, given what's happening next door. So I think the message really that Europe has, which is a strong one, is about security and survival in this period of crisis. I mostly agree with you, Misha, in your outline, but I think a semi-colony of the United States is maybe too strong. But Europe does have cards that it can play in this game. I think they're pretty big ones. You know, it's an enormous like consumer market. It's a regulatory superpower, as you guys have been emphasizing. But I think most of all, this question of uniting with the rest of the world is the critical one, and that does include China. And I think in the end, Trump has started a trade war that he can't win, and that's the opportunity for Europe, because Europe plus Canada plus Mexico plus China plus Brazil plus India plus South Africa, I mean that alliance economically would and I think will defeat what Trump is trying to do to the global system.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the European Union doesn't have to be a centralized state, and it is culturally, of course, very diverse.
I strongly disagree. I think we need a united European identity, and for that, we need a sitcom based in the suburbs of Vienna with all my Slav friends. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Now we want to know what you think. Should we allow the UK back in, or maybe only closer to a family dinner table? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. This show is brought to you by Eurozine, a free online magazine offering deep insights through articles from over 100 journals across Europe. The force behind this project is Display Europe, a platform for multilingual content on European politics and culture. Go check them out at displayeurope.eu. This project is co-funded by the EU and the European Cultural Foundation. The views and opinions here are those of the speakers and the authors only. Neither the European Union nor the EACA can be held responsible for them. Not that we would mind them taking advice from us or something.